June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht's assault on the Soviet Union marked the beginning of the most extensive, brutal, and bloody front of the Second World War. The invasion sought to achieve victory through a new form of warfare, the Lightning War, or Blitzkrieg. This strategy generated a new paradigm of dynamism in maneuver, prioritizing operational surprise, combined arms integration, and tempo to paralyze the enemy's response capability. However, its failure on extensive fronts like Russia was due to a lack of resources and the underestimation of local resistance. Hitler's ultimate goal was Moscow, but logistics became the silent enemy. Napoleon's defeat in Russia and the Axis difficulties in Africa during the Second World War both cite military logistics as a critical factor determining the success or failure of campaigns. Logistics becomes an essential strategic element. The offensive stalled at the gates of Moscow in the harsh winter of 1941. Our point of divergence, PD, is the key military question. What if the Wehrmacht had prioritized logistics, adequately supplied itself with fuel and provisions, and maintained its operational focus to surround and conquer Moscow before the autumn rains and the onset of winter in 1941? This counterfactual scenario implies a minimal change in strategic planning, but with massive geopolitical consequences. Counterfactual history is distinguished from alternate history, as we seek academic rigor here. In the real world, the failure of the Blitzkrieg in Russia was due to a lack of resources and the underestimation of local resistance. In this alternative timeline, the speed of maneuver does not stop. Aviation, armor, and radio, the protagonists of World War II, successfully maintained the offensive. The German Army's decision cycle in combat, which includes data collection, processing, decision, and execution, remains faster than that of its enemy. By the end of October 1941, German forces managed to lay siege to and ultimately conquer Moscow. The immediate impact is the collapse of the Soviet leadership. The fall of the capital does not mean the end of the war, but it is the political, military, and psychological beheading of the USSR. The government must be evacuated to the Urals, creating a power vacuum and a massive morale crisis. The Lightning War achieves its goal of paralyzing the enemy's response capability. Soviet generals who survived the purges would be forced into a rapid tactical reevaluation. Strategically, logistics is now the challenge of occupation, not the offensive. The Wehrmacht has overcome the mistake that prevented victory. However, logistics turns into a focused logistics nightmare, requiring the adequate provision of personnel, equipment, and provisions in the right place, at the opportune moment, and in the necessary quantity across the entire spectrum of military operations. Maintaining a supply line stretching thousands of kilometers into hostile territory with poor infrastructure becomes the main military objective. The wear and tear from disease and subalimentation among German troops would skyrocket. War in the 21st century adopts new forms like hybrid warfare. But in 1941, the Soviet resistance would already be employing guerrilla tactics, sabotage and subversion, what we would today call threshold warfare. This type of warfare, while not accelerated by technology yet, would challenge the German capacity to maintain knowledge and operational advantage. In the West, the fall of Moscow causes panic. The Truman Doctrine does not yet exist, but support for the USSR under the Lend-Lease Act is called into question. The US and Great Britain face a terrible dilemma. Should they divert all available resources to support a dying Eastern Front? Or should they prioritize the Pacific War and the invasion of Western Europe? The fall of the capital reinforces the feeling that the Eastern Front is a lost cause. The impact on the Pacific is indirect but crucial. Without the constant pressure from the Eastern Front, Germany can allocate more resources to the submarine war in the Atlantic, cutting vital supply routes to Great Britain. Furthermore, Germany could force Japan to coordinate attacks, mandating a redistribution of the American fleet just before the Battle of Midway. The Axis defeat in Africa, cited as an example of logistics importance, could be indefinitely delayed by not having to divert as many resources to the Eastern Front. The conflict witnessed the dramatic experience of displaced persons, evacuees, and refugees. This alternative timeline leads to a longer, grimmer war for the Allies. Allied military leaders like Patton and Montgomery, who in reality benefit from the pressure on Germany in the East, must reevaluate their plans. The study of great leaders is useful, and the experience of having been combatants in previous wars or having served as instructor officers becomes vital in this crisis. Pressure forces the West into a massive technological acceleration. Increased spending on research and development of complex technologies, such as cryptography, radar, and mathematical models, the beginnings of AI, becomes essential for military preparedness, seeking a knowledge advantage to shorten the conflict. The Lightning War had failed in Russia, but the tenacious Japanese defense in the Pacific would turn into prolonged and bloody trench warfare. The cost of this Moscow victory for Germany would be unsustainable in the long run. World War II resulted in a human tragedy with 340,000 Soviet and 45,000 Canadian soldiers dead, in addition to 35 million wounded and 3 million missing. Even though the Germans captured the capital, resistance would continue from the Urals, and the need to maintain vast garrisons in the east would devour the Reich's human and material resources. Oil, fuel, and steel allocated to the Eastern Front would become a constant drain. Focused logistics would demand a discipline and efficiency that Hitler's leadership, which prioritized politics over logistics, did not possess. The morale of German troops, facing winter after winter in an endless pacification campaign, would collapse, accelerating internal subversion. The occupation of vast Soviet territories would not bring peace, but total counterinsurgency warfare. Ideological control would be absolute. German leadership would be forced to divert even more elite divisions to the rear to fight partisans, which would reduce the capacity to defend the Western Front. The brutality of the occupation, far from breaking the population, would increase resistance on an unprecedented scale. Even the Manhattan Project would be affected. With the perception that the war in Europe had stalled and would drag on for years, the urgency and prioritization of resources such as enriched uranium and scientists could shift toward the European theater, delaying the development of the atomic bomb that ended the war in the Pacific. The cycle of decision in combat requires that data processing and analysis be accelerated. The need for intelligence, already high, would force the U.S. to invest massively in these areas. Historical rigor demands being exhaustive in data collection and honest in presentation. The counterfactual analysis reminds us that the failure of the Blitzkrieg in Russia was not due to a single cause, but to a complex mutual interaction. Hitler's leadership, which often dismissed his generals and focused on political goals rather than logistical ones, was the fatal mistake. The value of this reasoning is to elucidate why the failure actually happened, as almost all causal statements imply some kind of counterfactual. The conquest of Moscow was technically possible, but logistics made it unsustainable without rigorous planning. The risk of bias in counterfactual comparisons, such as pre-post comparisons or comparisons of enrolled versus non-enrolled groups, forces historical analysis to be based on empirically validated theoretical generalizations and mutually consistent secondary counterfactuals. The fall of Moscow did not guarantee German victory, but it certainly ensured the prolongation of terror and sacrifice on both fronts. The fatal mistake of Operation Barbarossa was not audacity, but logistics. Do you think the USSR would have been able to mount a counteroffensive from the Urals, or would the fall of Moscow have been the knockout blow for the Eastern Front? Leave us your counterfactual scenario in the comments. If you found this rigorous strategic analysis valuable, support us with a like. Subscribe to the channel for more military history and geopolitics documentaries, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into an alternate past.